Back in the day, the British didn't need harsh language to make a point. They had insults so clever and sharp they could cut without ever sounding vulgar. Your grandparents didn't just shout idiot or fool. They had a whole arsenal of insults that were funny, clever, and sometimes downright cruel. One of these old swears just made headlines again after a police sergeant tried to sue over it. Keep watching to find out which one. Here are 20 old British insults today's generation can't handle, starting with a word you haven't heard in years. 1. Sod. Sod feels mild now, but your grandparents knew it once had sharper teeth. The word comes from sodomite, which in earlier centuries was deeply offensive. By the mid-20th century, it had softened into everyday slang, used to mean an irritating person or simply as an exclamation. Sod off became a phrase heard in playgrounds, pubs, and workplaces alike, shouted when tempers rose or when someone pushed their luck. In the 1960s and 70s, it slipped into television and comedy shows, giving audiences a taste of cheeky language without crossing the censor's line. Your grandparents used it casually with phrases like lazy sod for someone slacking or poor sod for someone unlucky. In working-class homes, it fit right into the hierarchy of swearing, stronger than daft, but lighter than truly vulgar words. But our next word was much, much ruder. 2. Pranny. Pranny was sharp and cheeky, mostly rooted in the north of England, especially in Yorkshire and the northeast. It originally came from slang for female anatomy, which made it a ruder word than it sounds today. Over time, it watered down into something closer to fool or idiot, though it still carried enough bite to make its mark. Your grandparents would have heard it often in the 1960s through the 80s, shouted on playgrounds or football terraces when someone tripped, scored an own goal, or bungled something obvious. "You daft pranny" was a phrase that could sting, though it was usually followed by laughter. Unlike softer insults such as numpty or daft apeth, pranny sat closer to the rude end of the spectrum. It was rarely polite company material, which meant you probably would not hear it at the dinner table, but it filled the air at matches, pubs, and street corners. By the 1990s, it had nearly vanished, replaced by newer slang. If you thought pranny was harsh, wait till you hear the next one. 3. Muppet. Long before the name brought to mind Kermit and Miss Piggy, Muppet was already ringing out as a British insult. To call someone a Muppet in the 1970s and 80s was to say they were clumsy, useless, or downright daft. The word spread quickly thanks to football crowds and working-class slang, and the popularity of The Muppet Show gave it a playful edge. By the 1980s, schoolyards echoed with cries of "You Muppet" whenever someone tripped or fumbled. Even teachers and parents adopted it, often with a grin. It carried enough sting to make the point, yet enough humour to be laughed off. Your grandparents remember it as the perfect word for light banter, especially when Saturday night telly had everyone talking about puppets on the screen. While Muppet was only playful, the next insult hit much harder. 4. Git. Git may sound almost gentle today, but in its time, it was a cutting word. It began as a 19th century dialect term meaning offspring, often said with disgust. By the mid-20th century, it had turned into a sharp insult for someone irritating or unpleasant. Your grandparents would have heard it in schools, pubs, and especially in the comedy sketches of Monty Python, where lines like "You selfish git" earned big laughs. It was harsher than calling someone a muppet or pillock, carrying more venom than playful teasing. At its peak in the 1960s and 70s, gite was a staple insult across England. Mothers might mutter "stupid git" when scolding a child, while friends threw it around on football fields. But git couldn't compete with the raw sting of this next word. 5. Bounder. Bounder was once the insult of choice among the upper and middle classes, a word dripping with disdain for a man who behaved without honour. It was used to describe someone ungentlemanly, someone who broke the codes of social conduct by being crude. Your grandparents may have heard it in films or novels set among the well-to-do, where to be called a bounder was to be marked as untrustworthy. It often appeared in polite circles as a way of condemning a man without slipping into vulgarity. A suitor who courted a lady improperly, a businessman who cut corners, or a man who bragged too loudly at the club might be whispered about as a bounder. If you think bounder is bad, wait till you hear the next one. 6. Wok was one of those insults rooted in the gritty humour of Northern England. To call someone a wok was to call them a prize fool, the kind of person who poured tea into the sugar bowl or tripped over their own shoelaces. The word likely came from dialect tied to wassock, meaning to urinate, which gave it a crude undertone that made it stick in working-class banter. In the 1970s and 80s, Yorkshire pubs and football terraces echoed with it, shouted whenever a mate did something ridiculous. "You daft wok" was a phrase as common as ordering a pint, often said with a laugh, but never leaving any doubt that the target had blundered. It was also a favourite for comedians on TV who leaned on it for laughs without crossing the line into stronger language. Unlike harsher swears, it could be used in kitchens, classrooms, or on the shop floor, giving people a way to insult without shocking their gran. As common as wok was, this next insult carried more charm. 7. Chuffer. Chuffer belonged mostly to Yorkshire and parts of the north, a soft swear word that stood in for stronger curses. Depending on the moment, it could mean idiot or simply act as an exclamation when something went wrong. It gave people a way to vent frustration without letting truly vulgar language slip out. Your grandparents liked it because children could repeat it without scandal, making it a safe household swear. In the 1960s and 70s, it was part of everyday speech in working-class towns where dialects stayed strong. Men fixing cars under cold sheds muttered it when tools slipped, while women scolded kids with it when chores were left undone. It never travelled much outside Yorkshire, and that kept it a regional gem. On television, where censors frowned on harsher words, it occasionally slipped into dialogue, carrying all the impact of irritation without any real offence. But this next insult was even more unforgettable. 8. Numpty. Numpty carried the perfect balance of insult and affection. It labelled someone a fool, clumsy, or clueless, but often with a smile. By the 1970s and 80s, your grandparents in Scotland would have heard it shouted on football terraces, muttered in pubs, or spoken by teachers who wanted to scold without sounding too harsh. "You numpty" was the phrase tossed at a friend who locked his keys in the car or missed an open goal. It wasn't meant to wound, just to point out a daft mistake. In families, parents used it as a gentle rebuke, and children learned it early as a safe playground taunt. And here's the shocker. In March of 2025, a police sergeant even tried to sue after being called a numpty in a workplace dispute. The word itself likely came from Scots dialect with nump, meaning stupid, but it's softened with time. Comedians picked it up, threading it into television and stand-up routines, which helped it spread south into England. But while numpty was playful, the next insult would always get everyone's attention. 9. Daft apeth. Daft apeth, sometimes written daft apeth, was pure northern charm. It literally meant daft halfpenny, and it described someone silly or foolish. Your grandparents in Yorkshire or Lancashire would have heard it often in the 1950s through the 1970s, both in family kitchens and on the factory floor. Parents used it with children in the same way modern parents might say silly sausage, softening the sting with affection. "You daft apeth" was the scolding delivered when something got knocked over or forgotten. In workplaces, it became part of the daily banter that kept spirits up, especially in mills and factories where humour was a way to get through long shifts. Television picked it up too, slipping naturally into the humour of Coronation Street and Last of the Summer Wine. It captured the northern gift of using humour as both insult and kindness. But even daft apeth couldn't match the bite of this next insult. 10. Burk. Burk may sound tame to modern ears, but your grandparents knew it carried sharper roots. It came from Cockney rhyming slang, Berkshire Hunt, a stand-in for the rudest of words. Over time, people forgot the original connection, and it softened into something closer to fool or idiot. By the 1950s and 60s, it was heard in classrooms, pubs, and even at home when mothers scolded children for spilling tea or making mischief. British comedians loved it because it sounded cheeky while slipping past censors, which gave it a long life in sitcoms and sketch shows. You would often hear "Don't be such a Burke" shouted across schoolyards or whispered with a grin in pubs. Today it might sound silly, but for your grandparents, Burke was a sharp jab delivered with wit. But as cheeky as Burke was, the next insult cut even deeper. 11. Pillock. If someone was called a pillock in the north of England or Scotland, there was no mistaking the insult. The word reached back to Old Norse, where it once meant penis, giving it a sting that later softened. By the 20th century, it was the everyday way of saying idiot or blundering fool. Your grandparents heard it in pubs, workshops, and football terraces, particularly in the 1960s and 70s. Fathers muttered it under their breath when their sons made a daft mistake, while sitcoms used it for a laugh without sparking outrage. You daft pillock became a familiar insult, part scolding and part comic relief. For many, the word now carries nostalgia more than bite, remembered with affection as part of working-class banter. As rough as pillock was, the next word outshone it by mixing humour with humiliation. 12 Wally. Wally became a national craze in the 1970s and 80s, though its origins are debated. Some trace it back to seaside postcards, others to football chants, but by the mid-70s it was everywhere. Your grandparents will remember crowds at concerts suddenly shouting "Wally" during quiet moments, turning the word into a shared joke across the country. It meant a clumsy person or someone who was clueless. It quickly seeped into schools, pubs, and even television sitcoms. Parents used it to scold children for spilling sugar in their tea or forgetting homework, while friends tossed it around on football pitches when someone missed a goal. Its rise was tied to pop culture, with comedians and sketch shows leaning on it for laughs, which helped cement it in the language of the time. Wally was perfect for moments of light embarrassment, mocking someone for a silly mistake without crossing into cruelty. By the late 80s, it started to fade as new slang came in, but this next word was even more unforgettable. 13 Divvy. Divvy was born in Liverpool and spread across Merseyside before making its way around the north. It came from the word dividend, used in cooperative societies to describe members' shares. By the 1960s through the 80s, it had become a staple of playgrounds and workplaces. "You divvy" was a common cry when a kid dropped the ball during a game, or a worker mucked up a simple job. Your grandparents will remember it as an insult that carried just enough sting to make someone blush, but not enough to cause real harm. In pubs and homes, it often served as a joking put-down between friends or siblings, a way to poke fun while keeping the mood light. Merseybeat culture and Scouse comedians helped push it further into popular usage, and for Liverpool families it became a word so familiar it hardly needed explanation, even though it faded outside the region by the 1990s. The next insult our list landed even heavier. 14. Clot. Clot was once a common British insult, though it now feels almost quaint. The word came from the older meaning of clot as a lump, like a clot of blood, and so calling someone a clot was like calling them a lump of stupidity. It was especially popular in the 1950s through the 70s, often heard in schools, homes, and even on early television where harsher words could not be used. Teachers might bark "you clot" when a child dropped their books, and parents snapped it when kids forgot chores or caused a mess. Unlike insults with crude origins, clot carried the sting of authority rather than vulgarity. It was a word that corrected without humiliating. Your grandparents remember it as part of the language of discipline, used by adults who wanted to scold but keep the exchange polite. It slipped naturally into the humour of the era as well, appearing in comedies where stronger language would not pass the censors. By the 1980s, clot had already begun to sound old-fashioned, but in its day it was sharp enough to sting a little. But it definitely didn't sting like our next word. 15. Ninny. Ninny is one of the oldest insults on this video, stretching back centuries. Shakespeare used it, and by the mid-20th century it was still alive, though already sounding a little old-fashioned. It meant simpleton, fool, or someone making a fuss over nothing. Your grandparents will remember it being used most often in middle-class households and schools, particularly in the 1950s and 60s. "Don't be such a ninny" was a familiar phrase aimed at children who were worrying too much or turning a small mistake into a big drama. Teachers favoured it as a way to scold without harshness, while grandparents used it almost affectionately when correcting little ones. Its sound, light, and almost musical made it less threatening than insults like git or pranny. By the 1970s, it was fading, but it lingered in children's books and old films. But ninny was mild compared to our next insult. 16. Bampot. In Scotland, few insults rolled off the tongue as easily as bampot. It meant someone who was daft, foolish, or completely out of their wits. The word blended bam, meaning fool, with pot, suggesting madness. From the 1950s through the 1980s, your grandparents in Glasgow or Edinburgh would have heard it often in pubs, football terraces, or shouted across lively streets. It was the kind of insult that could sting, but was usually delivered with a laugh, especially after one pint too many. Scottish comedians like Billy Connolly kept it alive, spinning it into jokes that reached far beyond its home turf. For many, Bampot still carries the warm cheek of Scottish humour. As lively as Bampot was, our next word goes even further. 17 blighter. Blighter referred to an unpleasant or troublesome person, but it could also be spoken almost affectionately depending on the tone. Your grandparents might recall hearing it in wartime films or old radio broadcasts where soldiers called each other poor blighters to acknowledge hardship or rotten blighters to curse the enemy. It came into its own in the early to mid-20th century, spreading across classes and regions. In family kitchens, fathers used it when irritated with noisy children. In pubs, it rolled off tongues during arguments or banter. It carried a slightly old-world air, making it a favourite for writers who wanted dialogue that was biting yet respectable. But blighter fades in comparison to this next insult. 18. Rotter. Rotter was another insult steeped in class and character, used to describe someone deceitful, mean-spirited, or downright nasty. Unlike fool or numpty, it carried moral judgment. To be called a rotter was to be branded as rotten at the core, a person who could not be trusted. Your grandparents may remember hearing it in stories set in boarding schools where bullies or cheats were the absolute rotters. It was common in novels and films from the early 20th century, when writers sought a way to mark villains without stepping into vulgarity. At home, it might be muttered about a dishonest neighbour or an unreliable worker. Though it has mostly fallen out of use, rotter reflected a time when insults did not simply call someone foolish, but actually attacked their integrity. But this next insult attacked more than just your integrity. 19. Berkhamsted. Berkhamsted, often shortened to Burke, was born in Cockney rhyming slang. It came from Berkhamsted Hunt, a phrase used to cloak one of the rudest words in the English language. Over time, people forgot its roots and it softened into a casual insult meaning idiot or fool. Your grandparents would have heard it widely in London during the mid-20th century, where Burke became a common playground and pub insult. It was cheeky enough to make people laugh, but not so rude that it would shock in polite company. On television and radio, comedians leaned on it for its sound, which carried a punch without scandal. "You silly Burke" became a common phrase, especially in comedies of the 60s and 70s. Now brace yourself for the last word on our list today. 20. Chumplin. Chumplin was a regional term, fading from use by the mid-20th century, that described a bungler or dolt. It carried the sense of someone clumsy, hapless, or unable to manage even simple tasks. Your grandparents may have heard it in smaller towns, where local dialects coloured daily speech with words outsiders rarely knew. To call someone a chumplin was to laugh at their incompetence, whether they dropped a tool, spoiled a recipe, or botched a game. It never carried the sting of insults like rotter or git, but it was sharper than affectionate words like numpty. Its humour lay in its sound, round and slightly silly, which made it ideal for teasing children or co-workers without real malice. Which of these classic British swear words do you still remember? Let us know in the comment below. If you learnt something new today, please hit subscribe. See you in the next one.